On August 25, 1984, the body of a nurse midwife at Cleveland Metropolitan General Hospital was discovered in the second-story bedroom of her West Side home. The body was found by a co-worker and the dead woman's brother, who became concerned when she failed to appear at work or answer the phone. 33-year-old Mary Ann Flynn had been raped, beaten, stabbed, and strangled to death. Initially, the crime was thought to be the result of a burglary gone wrong. During the subsequent homicide investigation, the attention of the police soon focused on a convicted felon who had recently been hired by the victim to paint her house, 29-year-old Anthony Apanovich.
That afternoon, about 4:30, somewhere between 4 and 4:30, she came out of her house into her backyard, and I seen her, hollered at her, went across the street to ask her about finish painting the window frames, because that was the one thing she didn't contract me to do that wasn't done. She was going to do it herself, but I figured I could pick up another $50 or $75 for doing them. And we talked for about 10 minutes. She said she's going to do them herself, but with the cold weather coming on, if she didn't, then she'd let me know, and then I could do them for her. And that was the last time I saw her. I went back across the street. We finished up the job, me and Dawson, and headed out back to the bar, Pinky's Bar.
Apanovich's whereabouts on the night of the murder was of vital interest because forensics had fixed Mary Ann Flynn's time of death between midnight and the early morning hours of the 24th. Apanovich spent that evening drinking at 4 different bars and strip joints that he often frequented. Initially, his alibi appeared weak because he was confused about some time frames, and his witnesses were also drunk at the time. However, the police later verified Apanovich's activities that evening. Mary Ann Flynn was last seen alive at 10 p.m. by a neighbor who observed her coming home. A strange, loud noise was later heard around midnight by Miss Flynn's tenants in the duplex. They made no attempt to investigate, as no other sounds were heard.
I think it was Saturday morning, I read in the paper that Mary Ann had been murdered. And, I mean, you know, it's shocking. You read something, I mean, I knew this woman. It was a terrible thing, you know? I mean, it's just like anybody else. When something bad happens, you feel bad about it. And on Monday, 2 days later, on Monday morning, I went to work. That afternoon, I call home. My wife tells me that the homicide detectives were there, wanted to talk to me.
The single case that haunts me and that I think about every day is Tony Apanovich. And I'm part of the problem. Tony Apanovich was not a nice guy. He wasn't a good man. He wasn't the boy next door. He wasn't the kid that you hope your daughter will take to the prom. He was a small-time crook, a drunk, a womanizer. He ran around when his wife was pregnant. When she was having the baby, he was out drinking and womanizing. But he wasn't a murderer, and he wasn't a rapist.
There's nothing in my life that ever happened to me, including being here for a crime I didn't commit, that would cause me to go out and commit that type of crime, to just brutalize, rape, and murder a woman for nothing, for no reason. I mean, there's no reason for it.
In December of 1984, Anthony Apanovich was convicted on the basis of circumstantial evidence of aggravated burglary, rape, and murder, and sentenced to death. The validity of the interpretation of some of the key physical evidence introduced in the trial has been seriously questioned by reports only recently made available to the Office of the Ohio Public Defender.
3 days after Mary Ann Flynn was found murdered in her West Side Cleveland home, Tony Apanovich, along with other men, were questioned by the Cleveland Police Department. Tony voluntarily supplied hair samples, blood samples, and saliva samples, and none of this physical evidence matched that the police had at the time. Tony, a couple days later, was released from police custody, and it was about a month after that he was indicted for the murder of Mary Ann Flynn. When the Cuyahoga County prosecutor indicted Tony for the murder of Ms. Flynn, they had absolutely no physical evidence linking him to the crime.
At the trial, jurors were shown a photograph, a piece of photographic evidence, a picture of her bound hands, bound tightly behind her back as she was laying face down.
A hair was found on the victim's body. The state tested that hair, and it did not belong to Tony Epanovich. However, the state offered testimony that the hair was found on the victim's palm. The state, in a casual sort of way, tried to explain away the existence of this hair by stating that it could have fallen from the head of a morgue technician or a police officer at the scene, and that's what the state led the jury to believe, how this hair came to rest on the victim's palm. What we found out 9 years after the trial was that the hair was found on the victim's back under her bound hands. The state already said that it was not Tony's hair. There's only one way it could have gotten there, and that is it fell from the head of the killer.
The jury was told disregard the hair, and my attorneys couldn't attack this hair or point it out to the jury that this is crucial physical evidence which would convict the killer of this crime, because the prosecutor did not turn over this document to my attorneys at trial.
The whole purpose of the discovery, the fairness, is that the defense knows everything that the prosecution knows. That the whole aim is if the guy did it, he ought to be where he is. But if he didn't do it and evidence points away from him, the defense ought to get it. We didn't get any of the evidence that pointed away from him.
In all criminal prosecutions, the prosecuting attorney is under a duty to disclose all relevant and material evidence and information. That's codified in the rules of the state. It's a matter of basic fairness. In this case, however, Mr. Epanovich's case, 9 years after the fact, we find out that relevant, important, exculpatory information was deliberately withheld from Mr. Epanovich's attorneys at trial. This is a serious miscarriage of justice.
As they do in every rape case, fluids were gathered from the woman's body and tested. Those test results indicated that the fluids were deposited by a type A secretor. Tony was a type A secretor, and the state argued that since Tony was a type A secretor, he was within 40% of the population that could have deposited that semen inside the victim. What we found out after the trial was that the victim was also a type A secretor. And since the victim was a type A secretor, the results that the coroner testified to at trial and offered into evidence were totally erroneous and inconclusive.
Mary Ann Flynn's secretor status was not noted on the original laboratory examination report from the coroner's office. This omission resulted in an incorrect interpretation as to the relevancy of the test.
Normally, the ABO blood group is determined by testing red cells. For individuals who carry a gene called secretor, which is inherited from one or both parents, it's possible to also detect the ABO substance in body fluids, such as saliva. In the case of a woman, you would find it in vaginal secretions. In a man, you would find it in their semen or seminal fluid, as well as other body fluids. So in the case of a rape between a female who's a group A secretor and a male who's also a group A secretor, you would expect to find a substance in the woman's vaginal secretions after the fact, but it would be virtually impossible to determine the source of that A substance.
Tony's lawyers were not told at trial that the victim was also a type A secretor. And if this information had been given to them, the attorneys could have told the jury that the results that the prosecution was putting forward were inconclusive and invalid because that seminal fluid could have been deposited by any person.
And I think that's the only way that I can get anybody to believe I'm innocent, is to get this evidence in front of a judge. in front of a jury and let them decide. Yeah.
After 9 years of sitting on death row, Tony Epanovich got access to part of the Cleveland Police Department homicide file. That file contains information that indicates Tony is not responsible for the murder and rape of Marianne Flynn. That information was deliberately withheld from Tony at trial. It was deliberately withheld from his defense attorneys, and it deprived Tony of a fair and just trial.
The tragedy here is that the good system, the fair system, the just system that we've had for 200 and some years, it didn't happen here. And we got a guy sitting on death row, maybe weeks, maybe months, but I don't think it's going to be years away from facing that 2,300 volts. And then again, it is academic.
Tony Epanovich isn't asking for a life sentence. He isn't asking to be relieved from the death penalty. What he is asking is a new trial, to bring out all of this evidence that we've subsequently uncovered, to put these questions, these issues before a jury, to let them decide. He's convinced, as well as I'm convinced, that if that would transpire, if that would take place, if we could get before a jury, show them this information, he would be acquitted of this crime.
The recently released homicide file contains other information that supports Epanovich's claim of innocence. The jury was misled as to the victim's time of death, as well as by a statement made by Epanovich prior to his indictment. The information that numerous repairmen and former patients of the midwife had keys to the house was never shared with defense counsel at the trial. One of Miss Flynn's former companions was abusive. Epanovich's attorneys recently learned that a man convicted of 30 rapes occurring between 1983 and 1988 committed 6 of these brutal acts in Miss Flynn's neighborhood shortly before and after she was raped and murdered. The assailant in those crimes had long, dark hair of the same type as the hair found under the bound hands of Marianne Flynn.
So how can I make you believe me? By what I say, I can't. Nothing I say is going to convince anybody. Yeah. But the evidence proves I didn't kill her.
Today, Anthony Epanovich remains on death row.